How is everyone? Good. Thank you, Alex, for the kind introduction. Thank you to Students for Life for putting on this amazing conference, and thank you to each and every one of you for taking the time out of your day to be here. I have a confession to make. This is not kosher in this business. I work in the prediction business, the commentary business, and I've changed my mind on something. Most of the time, commentators just push that to the side and pretend that they haven't changed their mind, but I did. I changed my mind about something. I was very pessimistic about Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health. I said on my show the day before the oral arguments, I said, listen, I'm not excited about it because I'm just not prepared to be disappointed. I'm not prepared to be heartbroken, so I'm just gonna compartmentalize it, push it out of my mind, and just keep on keeping on. So then I listened to the 2 hours of oral arguments. They, of course, were available on audio. And I've changed my mind. Now, let me say this. I don't know how the 9 justices will rule. Will they overturn Roe? I don't know. Will they not? I don't know. But I will say, I feel much more optimistic because if you listen very closely to what these justices said, each and every one of them during these oral arguments, they actually drop clues about how they might rule. Now, some drop more than others, and some we don't necessarily need to hear their clues. We know that their minds were made up before they came. But the one thing that I was very surprised about during these oral arguments is how weak the arguments were from the pro-aborts. I expected them to have a nuanced argument, to make a very legalistic pitch to the Supreme Court justices, and I was waiting for it, and waiting for it, and waiting for it, and all I heard was a twofold argument. I heard, it's about the woman's body, the woman's choice. And I thought to myself, really? That's the argument you're making, even though scientifically we know that life begins at conception and the DNA of the baby is separate individual DNA compared to the mother. You're making an argument that this is about one body, not two. And that's where they stopped. And then they made an argument that Roe versus Wade cannot be overturned, that the justices, it doesn't matter what they think, they're essentially not allowed, they're prohibited from overturning it because it's settled law, it's precedent. And for some reason, the lawyers arguing in favor of abortion, in favor of Roe v. Wade, I guess don't know the history of our country because they're making an argument that precedent once ruled cannot be overturned. And that, I mean, you don't have to be a Supreme Court justice to know that that's false. So I thought, okay, well, let's listen to each one of these justices. Let's look at maybe the most important thing that each justice has said and see if we can glean some clues about how they might rule here. So, Breyer, well, we know how he's going to rule. Sotomayor's comment, actually, she has just been on a little rager lately, hasn't she? Sotomayor's comment, I mean, she called us a stench. She called the pro-life movement a stench. This was her quote, "Will this institution," meaning the Supreme Court, "survive the stench that this creates in the public perception that the Constitution and its reading are just political acts?" Oh, imagine if we applied that sentence to Plessy versus Ferguson. If that kind of precedent, that settled law was a stench, that we were a stench for wanting that overturned. So I think we know how she's going to rule. Kagan, we know how she's going to rule. If you read their arguments, they had prepared exactly what they wanted the world to know they personally think about abortion. So when I say we can write the three of them off, I think that's fair. They're going to vote to uphold Roe. Then, of course, so we have this trifecta at the Supreme Court, right? It's not really a 6-3 conservative majority. It's really a 3 versus 3 versus 3. The 3 liberals, the 3 conservatives, and then these 3 that seem to hold precedent higher than the Constitution, even when they lean right. So the 3 liberals, we know how they're going to vote. The 3 conservatives, we can be pretty confident how they're going to vote, although my favorite line from the oral arguments was when Thomas said, quote, "I know your interest here is in abortion." LOL. "I understand that," he says, "but if I were to ask you what constitutional right protects the right to abortion, is it privacy?" he said. "Is it autonomy? What would it be?" And that, I'm just like, man, this guy's a legend. And the lawyer, Rickelman, was like, "It's liberty." And we're like, oh, okay, yeah. Exactly. Okay, so Thomas, we know how Thomas is going to rule. He stated before that he would overturn it. Alito, we can be pretty confident how he's going to rule. He's a pretty solid conservative. Gorsuch, I think, tipped his hand. I mean, I was pretty sure how he was going to rule, but Gorsuch tipped his hand because he said, if this court will reject the viability line, do you see any other principle that the court could choose? Now, this is what we call a trick question in the media business, because he knows the answer to that question. He just wanted to hear them say it or dodge it. So those three, we know how they're going to rule. The 3 liberals are going to uphold, 3 conservatives are going to overturn. But what about these 3 middles? What about these 3 middles? And this is where my pessimism turned to some cautious optimism, because we have Roberts here who's worried about his political legacy. We have Roberts who's worried about public opinion, how he's going to be viewed in our history books. And this is his comment that I think we should focus on the most. He said, if you think that the issue is one of choice, viability, it seems to me, doesn't have anything to do with choice. If really it is an issue about choice, why is 15 weeks not enough time? Now, this is very interesting, I think. When you're trying to get inside Robert's head, which, for better or for worse, we want to, this is very interesting because he actually undermines their fundamental argument. He undermines this fundamental, arbitrary, invented standard of viability that the court has imposed on our entire nation with his one question. And so as long as he is not swayed by this false idea that you cannot overturn settled law, that you cannot rule precedent to be incorrect if that precedent is correct, then I think his mind is on the right track here. And so I heard that and I thought, oh, interesting, because I expected him to come out just talking about precedent, very worried about the image of the court if they overturned a ruling that's been around for 49 years. Kavanaugh was the one, remember, he was the judge who wrote the concept of Roberts' Obamacare ruling. This is before Kavanaugh was on the Supreme Court. He essentially created Roberts' argument that the Obamacare penalty was a tax, and Roberts just echoed that. So I didn't have a lot of hope for Kavanaugh. But this is my favorite thing that was said, besides Thomas, this is my favorite thing that was said in the oral arguments. He said, if the court had simply followed precedent in those cases, and he's talking about many cases that were overturned, the country would be a very different place. He says if you think about some of the most important cases, the most consequential cases in this court's history, there's a string of them where the cases overruled precedent. Brown versus Board outlawed separate but equal. Baker versus Carr, which set the stage for one person, one vote. West Coast Hotel, which recognized the state's authority to regulate business. Miranda versus Arizona, which required police to give warnings about the right to remain silent and have an attorney present to suspects in criminal custody. Lawrence versus Texas, which said that the state may not prohibit same-sex conduct. Matt versus Ohio, which held that the exclusionary rule applies to state criminal prosecutions to exclude evidence obtained in violation of the Fourth Amendment. By the way, he did not write this down. This was all from the top of his head. I read about half of it. He goes on, and he concludes with that statement. If the court had simply followed precedent, our country would be a very different place. Now, I could be wrong about this, but ladies and gentlemen, I think we have Kavanaugh. And remember, in a hypothetical 6-3 split, we don't need Roberts. I'm not saying there's not hope. And Amy Coney Barrett had an interesting train of thought here. She focused on the parenthood, the right to relinquish your parental rights, meaning if you don't want to be a parent, you don't have to be a parent. You can place your child for adoption. There are safe haven laws. And that's very interesting, I think. An interesting way to look at it, if that's the way she's looking at it. Of course, the pro-abortion attorneys said that these women didn't want to be pregnant, they don't have to, but it's pretty clear that Amy Coney Barrett is pro-life. It just depends on whether she will view the Constitution as the highest law in the land or precedent as the highest law of the land. Now, like I said, there is this 3-3 split, but I have hope. And one of the reasons I have hope is because we know the Supreme Court justices listen to us. We know that they don't lock themselves away in their chambers. I mean, did you hear Sotomayor during the COVID, the vax mandate? She said 100,000 children had COVID and were on ventilators. We know she watches CNN. We know they listen to us. We know they listen to us. And we know that politics aside, they know that there is no right to abortion in the Constitution. There is no right to abortion in the 14th Amendment. There are no penumbras and emanations that even suggest a right to abortion in the 14th Amendment. We know that science says a human life begins at the moment of conception. We know that 95% of academic biologists, not just here, but all around the world, say a human life begins the moment a sperm fuses with an egg. We know the baby has unique DNA. We know that the baby is separate from the mother's body, a distinct human being. We know that individual human beings deserve their God-given, inherent, unalienable right to life. We know that we have no right to end that precious human life for our own convenience. We know that abortion brutally ends that baby's life by dismemberment, by lethal injection, by suffocation, by deprivation of nutrients. We know, you and I, the American people, know that it is our responsibility as Christians, as conservatives, as constitutionalists, as Democrats too, as liberals, as progressives, as atheists, as Americans, to relentlessly, wholeheartedly, passionately, culturally, theoretically, rhetorically, and legally protect the lives of tiny, sweet babies across our country. So now, as we wait, let us pray that the 9 justices on the Supreme Court who hold the lives of millions of unborn babies in their hands acknowledge these universal truths too. So pray your heart out. I don't know, again, I'm in the prediction business. I don't know how the Supreme Court's gonna rule, but after listening to the 2 hours of oral arguments, I do have hope. And I know that the rest is up to God. God bless you. Thank you very much for having me today.